This is Shane Thomas of Upstream Ag Insights, and today I'm doing something a little different. I've had a number of requests over the last little while to cover some of the bigger reports I write about in audio form, and I've been a bit hesitant. A lot of what I publish leans heavily into charts, tables, images, and audio is a tough medium for that sort of thing. But there's one report where I think the conversation is rich enough and the questions are interesting enough that it's worth putting into audio without the visuals in front of you, though some of you might be listening to this as an audio podcast. Some might be watching it on video. So I will try to have some of the visuals within the video component. So if you do want to follow along with the charts, there is the written version within Upstream Ag Professional, and I'd encourage you to check that out, or you can watch this on the video version as well. So today we're going to dive into the Dunham Trimmer 2025 Global Biostimulant Report. And so for those who aren't familiar, Dunham Trimmer is one of the most respected market research firms in the global biological space. They've been tracking biostimulants, biofertilizers, biocontrol, and all that sort of segment and realm for years. And when they put out a report, it tends to be the reference point that the rest of the industry orients around. They were generous enough to share the report with me and give me the latitude to pull out insights, takeaways, and learnings to publish and share with all of you. So a big thank you to the Dunham Trimmer team for that. And if you do want, and so what I want to structure the next 30 minutes or so as is I'm going to start by talking about why biostimulants are interesting to me personally and what I see as the value of them and why they're gaining interest and traction and that sort of thing, and why I think they matter from an agronomic standpoint. Then I'll walk through the global numbers from the Dunham Trimmer report, zoom into North America, and from there spend a little bit of time on what I think is the most important strategic question in the category right now, which is surrounding how do you avoid alcohol. So with that, let's get into why biostimulants and why I care personally. And I want to start with some personal context because I think it matters for how I read this report and how I think about this segment in general, which is one that I'm very passionate about, very interested in, one I've been talking about for a number of years within Upstream and elsewhere. I came into the industry as an agronomist originally, and I began heavily researching biologicals in about 2009. So I was in kind of my first or second year within the industry when I really got into them. And I remember specifically reading journal articles on PGPRs or plant growth promoting rhizobacteria and seaweed-based biostimulants and their impact on plants. And I began asking constantly about the segment to anyone that would really listen to me at the time because it was tough to find anybody that had a detailed understanding at that point. But you could go to anybody and talk about seed and crop protection, and that was great. But biostimulant questions were tough to find the right person, but I was always trying to ask questions. And I mostly got looks and comments surrounding snake oil. And that always stood out to me, seeing all the potential of these products and the segments and the molecules, but everybody kind of throwing it aside, at least at that time. And as a random aside on the snake oil side of things, I actually began writing content online initially in 2011 or 2000. I wrote my first ever article actually within realagriculture.com. Big thanks to Sean Haney who gave me that opportunity. But it was titled Beware of Snake Oils on the Farm. And so it was all about how do you think about trying to mitigate the likelihood of some poor actor, some bad product being used on your farm, and it was targeted at farmers, and really going through how do you trial, how do you think about assessing the products, what questions should you ask. And so this is something that is an area that I've been trying to learn about, trying to figure out, and just been really interested in for a long time, the better part of 2 decades at this point. And so I've spent time walking fields and looking at crops and trying to figure out why a plant in one part of a field looks different than a plant 15 feet away, or just any sort of why does this stress look like this in this field? Why does this field look different from that field? What are the gaps? What are the issues that are causing this to be in the field? And, a lot of the time it's weeds, sometimes it's disease, sometimes it's insects, sometimes it's some other practice. And of course, all those things are important to consider and look at. And they're much more tangible and salient than the average abiotic stress. But to me, abiotic stress is really one of the really interesting areas of crop production. We've been really good at managing biotic stresses thanks to the likes of Monsanto and Bayer and BASF and Corteva and all these different groups have obviously given a ton of tools to manage these biotic stresses, weeds, disease, insects. But the harder, sort of messier, less obvious sort of stress is the abiotic type, which is, heat and drought and salinity, frost, waterlogging, and cold snaps, those sorts of things, all can hit a plant when and make it vulnerable to yield drag or quality drag. And so those are things that can quietly take 10 or 15% off of a yield potential. And historically, there hasn't been much emphasis around managing them. They were viewed as uncontrollables. So that's one reason that I got really into them. That's not even to mention the nutrient efficiency side of things and how crop nutrition drives quality and yield. And so biostimulants are interesting to me because they sit in that space. They're products that at their best help a plant manage its own physiology under stressful conditions. They influence water use, photosynthesis, root architecture, nutrient uptake, hormone balance, the timing of senescence. These are all levers that determine whether a crop hits its potential or falls short. And for most of my career, these levers were not really addressable, or they were harder to address consistently in terms of having high quality products, opportunities to tank mix, the ability to go test and get real good data. But that has been constantly changing over the last, call it 10 plus years. And so when I started, biostimulants had a big reputation problem. As I alluded to, there were a lot of products on the market that made big claims but didn't always deliver. And they were sold by people who couldn't explain how they worked in a lot of instances. And so the longtime believers in the category have been championing these products for decades, and they deserve a lot of credit for keeping the conversation alive through some pretty skeptical years. But as we've moved into the mid 2020s, something has shifted, and I think the science has caught up. Our understanding of plant physiology is meaningfully better than it was even 10 years ago. Tools to measure plant response or look at the RNA or the transcriptomics of a plant, or things like NDVI and hyperspectral imagery everywhere, and being able to look at and see how is a plant feeling, how is a crop looking relative to previous context or what it was a week ago, for example. And so you have change detection and those sorts of capabilities in the tech world as well too. You have new entrants coming in like crop diagnostics that can give you a window into what a plant is actually experiencing. And these all have helped make the outcomes from biostimulant use feel more real to the people buying them, or be able to show the variation and contrast between not using and using. And I think the corporate world has noticed, and can go into all the different scenarios that have occurred over the last 6 or so years. All the major players have made meaningful moves into the space, and the lines between crop protection, crop nutrition, and plant health are blurring. And biostimulants sit at this sort of interesting intersection where they can impact plant health, which allows a crop to better fend off disease or increase access to nutrients, for example. And so you kind of have this interesting intersection between all the fertilizer, crop protection, and then biostimulants as that sort of bridge in between to see how they compete and support these various other crop input actions. And so when I look at this report, I'm not looking at it as just another market research document. I look at it as a snapshot of a category that has become much more mainstream and is now wrestling with what comes next, because I think that's one of the interesting things that stood out to me as I was reading the report. And so there's these forces really converging, and I think they're all worth naming briefly before we get into the numbers, because they're the reason in my mind this category is growing. And really, the first is the recognition of abiotic stress as a yield limiter. I already touched on this, but the gap between record yields and average yields on most crops is enormous, and a huge portion of that gap is environmental. As tools to measure and quantify abiotic stress have improved, the value proposition of products that mitigate it has become much easier to articulate. And so I have an image that has the average yield drag relative to record yield. So what the gap is between record yields and average yields in major crops like corn and wheat and soybean. And so this data is from like the 2000, I want to say probably the late 90s, but I think the work was published in 2000 or so. And you had the average corn yield is 76 bushels. And I believe, again, this is not just specific to the US, this is elsewhere. But at that time, you had 76 bushel average corn, and you had the record yield is somewhere around 315 bushels. But the data shows that somewhere around 200 plus bushels of that difference between record and average came from abiotic stresses, whereas only about 27 came from the biotic losses. You see similar in wheat, where you have an average wheat yield of 31 bushels per acre and a record yield of 232 bushels per acre, and the abiotic stress accounting for about 180 bushels an acre, whereas biotic only being about 21. Now, again, we have access and have had access to fantastic crop protection products for disease, insects, weeds. And so that's why the number is so small on the biotic number, but it just shows where the opportunity is to be able to better manage abiotic stresses. And even if you go look at, Randy Dowdy or David Hula, I've always been fascinated by what the world record crop holders are, whether it's in wheat in New Zealand or the UK, or corn and soybean in the US with individuals like Randy and David. And if you go look at what they're doing on their world record fields, they're managing the abiotic and nutrient components of their crops in incredibly unique detail, and which I think further reinforces the value of managing abiotic stresses. The second thing that stands out to me really driving things in adoption is nutrient use efficiency across crops, across countries, across all the different nutrients. The percentage of applied fertilizer that actually ends up in the plant is shockingly low. That's bad for farmers and it's bad for the environment. Biostimulants that improve root architecture, enhance nutrient availability, or improve stomatal regulation, for example, can meaningfully shift how much of every single fertilizer dollar a farmer spends actually does what it's supposed to do. And so as input costs stay elevated and as environmental regulations tighten, I think this matters even more. And an interesting chart just shows that nutrient use efficiency of nitrogen is somewhere around 30 to 50%, meaning more than 50% of the nutrients do not get into the plant after they've been applied, meaning they end up in volatilizing, they end up in groundwater, whatever it might be, depending on the scenario and the situation, but very small percentage actually get to the crop versus something like 10 or 20% efficient over, call it in the first year. I think there's varying data depending on what sort of study you want to reference, but it's not anywhere near 100%, at least not in the first couple of years. You have even micronutrients like zinc and copper and manganese, which are still in that 1, 2, 5% sort of efficient. So really big opportunity to be more efficient, and biostimulants can support that. The third is the broader recognition that healthier plants are more productive plants. And again, this has been acknowledged for a while, but I think plant physiology, or a plant that's physiologically strong, competes better with weeds, fends off disease and insects more effectively, and provides or produces more grain per unit of input. And as we've gotten better at understanding plant physiology, and as omics work has expanded our ability to characterize how biostimulants actually interact with plant systems, the connection between plant health and overall farm performance has become a lot more credible. I have this really this chart that's been influential on me. I believe where I found it originally was from some Stoller work, but it really highlights the understanding of how various hormones within the plant spike and drop at various stages of that plant's life, how nutrients are supportive of stimulating the utilization of those or the elicitation of those hormones. And so you can start to see how that deeper understanding and our ability to influence it is really something that we can exploit moving forward. And I believe biostimulants can further support that, where if we know that ethylene is spiking and we know that it's spiking earlier than it should, you can use a biostimulant, say a seaweed-based biostimulant, that can actually decrease that ethylene ratio or that ethylene amount in the plant at that given time, decreasing the time that that plant is under stress, for example. And so a bunch of different things that can be done there. And I think the fourth reason that we see a lot of interest is really on the major incumbents. And again, I think it's because they see a lot of the opportunity. They probably see a ton of the environmental and the challenges from a regulatory on their core synthetic products or on their fertilizers, whatever it might be. But if you look at how the major incumbents, major crop protection, major crop input companies have this opportunity for new revenue access, new value pool capturing, meaning today they're not if you go look at a BASF, on average, they're not capturing very much of a farmer's fertility budget. And so there's an opportunity for them to move into that segment by talking about fertility based things with a biostimulant as one example. And so again, this is where they're having some shrinking margins, they're having challenges on legacy chemistry, regulatory dynamics. There is an opportunity for them to tap into a different budget, tap into a different product segment, and at this point, access a product that could have higher EBITDA margins than what their core business has been. Again, we'll talk a little bit about how that might not be the case long term and how there's already some challenges, but fundamentally, it shows that these groups see this big opportunity. And when you start to have these bigger players, when you look at the likes of Corteva and Bayer and these sorts of players, they're very, very good at creating demand, educating on product segments, being able to actually deliver trust into the market because of what they've done in other segments, whether it's fungicides or whether it's seed treatments, for example. And so they might not have a core competency in plant nutrition or in biostimulants necessarily, but they have some of the skills and cultural competencies to be able to get farmers to a point of conviction with these biostimulant products. They know how to run trials, they know how to actually commercialize products much more effectively than the average startup organization, for example, and they have the distribution and reach to be able to do that. And so you can see that there's a ton of upside and potential there for them. And we can see just from the acquisitions over the last number of years, whether it is Mosaic with Plant Response or Valagro with Syngenta, for example, or Stoller and Corteva, there's been a ton of acquisitions, and I'm sure we'll see more in the coming years. And so with that sort of context, we can get into some of the actual components of the report. And so we'll start a little bit with the global market, and then we'll move down to the North American market. And a few quick notes on what's actually in the report itself. So DunhamTrimmer's 2025 report covers non-microbial biostimulants only. So if you're thinking about nitrogen fixing bacteria or phosphate solubilizing microbes or other live microbial inoculants, these are not in the report. They're covered in DunhamTrimmer's separate biofertilizer report, and an updated version of that one is coming out in the first quarter of next year, I believe, so 2027. The reason is that microbial products have a different commercial structure, different companies participate, different regulatory considerations, and lumping them in with all the other biostimulants could muddy the picture. And so this report excludes the biological or the microbial components. They also exclude value-added fertilizers, even though many of those products do contain biostimulant ingredients. And so if the way they kind of structured this is if the primary purpose is nutrient delivery, it's classified as a fertilizer because the global value-added fertilizer market is about $19.8 billion. The other things that are excluded include plant growth regulators like auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins, which are regulated as pesticides in many jurisdictions, and they typically work by forcing plant responses rather than supporting natural ones. And they also exclude botanical extracts used for pest control because those fall under biocontrol. And so chitosan, despite sometimes being a biostimulant, is excluded as well because its primary mode of action is pathogen-resistant solicitation. Phosphites are also in that same camp. And so the product categories Dunham Trimmer uses are amino acids, protein, hydrolysates, humic and fulvic acids, and other organic acids, and then seaweed extracts, and a composite others category that includes some botanical extracts, inorganic biostimulants like silicon or selenium, and anything else outside the three main groups that can elicit a biostimulatory response. And so Dunham Trimmer has actually profiled more than 575 companies across 30 countries that each have a market exceeding $20 million, that's USD. Together, those countries account for about 80% of global revenue. So 20 countries, 30 countries accounts for about 80% of revenue, which is interesting for sure. They estimate that there are over 1,000 companies formulating biostimulants globally, but as you'd expect, more than 90% of them are privately held with no public revenue data. So this category is hard to research. That's another reason to give the Dunham Trimmer team credit for the work they've done, because it's really hard to get this data. That's why I know I always appreciate, even well before I'd ever met anybody within the organization, I remember referencing Dunham Trimmer data because it was always really well done and hard to find anywhere else. And so The global biostimulant market, according to Dunham Trimmer, hit $4.47 billion in 2024. And the Dunham Trimmer, and they project it to reach 7.88 billion by 2030. And so that's a compound annual growth rate of about 9.9%, so just under 10%, which is obviously a pretty healthy trajectory and significantly faster than crop protection. Again, depending who you talk to, some people will say that that seems a little bit too high. We might actually see a reversion to the mean. It might start to decline a little bit over time, but that's what Dunham Trimmer has stated as the expected CAGR out until 2030. And so some other interesting notes, Latin America and Asia Pacific have overtaken Europe as the largest biostimulant using region, which is a pretty important shift because Europe is actually the birthplace of biostimulants. So Spain and Italy were the original adopters and users, and where companies like Valagro built the category out. But growth in those historical core markets has slowed significantly because they're getting more and more saturated. Latin America is projected to approach 30% of global market share, with the highest regional growth rate driven primarily by Brazil. And so we see a ton of conversation about Brazil, and a lot of the usage in Brazil is actually on the biocontrol side of things. So there's a lot of for nematodes and those sorts of things there, but there is still a significant biostimulant market. And I get messages about Brazil all the time. There's interesting things going on there, whether it's on farm manufacturing of having biological stills and there's just a lot more comfort and interest. And when you also have two crops and you don't have a freeze thaw cycle to kill off insects, there's just more need for more tools in the toolbox, so to speak. There's, of course, tons of interest in Brazil all the time, older soils, all these different things. But getting back into it, Asia Pacific is really growing because of China and India. And so these are markets that are still on the early part of the adoption curve, and they have strong underlying demand drivers, both economic and agronomic. Europe and North America, meanwhile, are growing at rates below 10%. So that's not really because of weakening demand, but it's because the base is so large now that the relative percentages naturally compress. And so in absolute dollar terms, the global market is adding roughly $500 million per year right now. And Dunham Trimmer forecasts it will add about 650 million between 2029 and 2030. So that last year will go up quite a bit more. So while the percentage growth rate has come down from previous reports, the absolute opportunity is bigger than it's ever been within the biostimulant segment. So with that, we'll get into North America. And just a note on geography, Dunham Trimmer treats Canada and the US as North America and includes Mexico in the Latin American numbers, and I do the same typically. And so the North American biostimulant market crossed the $1 billion mark in 2024 and is projected to grow to nearly 1.7 billion by 2030. The compound annual growth rate is 0.3%. So a little slower than the global average, slower than Latin America, but of course still quite strong. The United States accounts for over 90% of the total sales between Canada and the US, unsurprisingly. And the US is the largest single biostimulant market in the world. And even with a slower growth rate, it will continue to add the most absolute dollars of any market globally. About $500 million are to be added between 2024 and 2030. And so the three drivers of that North American growth really come to things that are not going to be all that surprising to anyone. But the first is the rising use of biostimulants in row crops and cereals, which has historically been a less developed segment. So obviously tons of growth in the high value segment, high value row crops or leafy greens or whatever it might be. And so you can see a ton of market on the West Coast, your PNW or Pacific Northwest and California, for example. The second driver of North American growth is increasing focus on nutrient use efficiency. So we're hearing a lot more and more about that. And the third is interest in managing abiotic stress, which we've already talked about. And so within the US, adoption has expanded in row crops and cereals, and the market overlaps significantly with the value-added fertilizer segment in U.S. farming operations, especially row crop operations. Efficiency and operational convenience are, of course, huge drivers of adoption. And so anything that requires an extra pass over the field or an extra tank or an extra piece of labor faces a much higher bar to get adopted. So the products that have done well in the U.S. are often integrated bionutrition products where a biostimulant is co-formulated with a nutrient and applied in a single pass. And again, I know I said earlier that Dunham Trimmer doesn't include the value-added fertilizer segment, but it comes back to what's the core driver of the usage. Is it for nutrition or is it for biostimulant effects? And so just keep that in mind. One of the most interesting numbers in the North American section is the breakdown by product type. Humic and fulvic and organic acids are the dominant category in North America, accounting for more than 40% of total regional sales in 2024, which is a pretty big divergence from the rest of the world, where humic and fulvic acids represent less than 33% of the market, so less than a third of the market. North America is genuinely the world's largest market for this humic and fulvic category. And there's a reason for that. So North America has direct access to some of the highest quality leonardite ore deposits globally, particularly in North Dakota and parts of the Western US and Canada. And so those deposits drove the emergence of a strong domestic mining and processing industry, which in turn enabled a well-established supply base for humic and fulvic products. There's a really interesting cross-reference here too. If you look at Stratus Ag Research's 2023 USA Tracking Biostimulant Use and Satisfaction Survey, which I've covered within Upstream, organic acids had the strongest level of satisfaction amongst farmers and the highest intention to use again. So the category is not only the largest in North America, it's also the one farmers feel the best about, which is of course a good combination for continued success for players in that segment with that product category. Dunham Trimmer also noted that while the humic and the fulvic category will retain the lead in North America, its relative share is projected to decline gradually over the coming years, with amino acids and protein hydrolysates showing the strongest growth in recent years. That growth is being driven not only by specialized biostimulant companies, but also by major distributors that import hydrolysates primarily from China and incorporate them into biostimulant blends and value-added fertilizer combinations. So these formulations have really been aggressively promoted in the high-value crop sectors, and they are gaining presence in row crops. An area that is covered in the report too that I found interesting is really the application types. This is something I think about a lot because I focus so much on row crops and the importance of operational efficiency and being able to get products into the crop, onto the crop at the right time with the least amount of friction. Globally, foliar is a significant driver of treated acres of biostimulants, but in North America, foliar is less dominant, and soil and seed applications actually make up the largest share compared to the rest of the world. And so what really stands out to me is how each of those application types is being unlocked in new ways for the row crop segment specifically. And so when I think about this comes back to some of the other tech, and the thing that kind of interests me is this intersection of how everything ties together. And on the foliar side, you have companies like John Deere with the See and Spray Ultimate, or you have Green Eye Technologies with their dual tank systems. And so they're actively building multi-tank systems onto sprayers, which increases the optionality for applying these products. And so that means you can add a biostimulant to a crop protection application across the field without needing to tank mix and without needing to do an extra pass. Just a quick note on that. Like I remember getting yelled at by farmers because of recommending products that companies told me they'd tested. They told me it was okay to mix, and then you mix it and you run into issues where it just clumps up the sprayer, plugs it. It's terrible experience. And I don't necessarily blame the companies. What I'm getting at there is they might have done the testing, but I remember one instance where the water quality changed everything entirely, where the company was based in a major Canadian city. And to do the testing of the herbicide that was being mixed with their specific carbohydrate-based product, they used the city water there, which had a very different response relative to the well water that was being used by the farmer, which caused one of the biggest headaches I ever experienced as an agronomist. And so anyways, when you start to put in an extra tank, you can eliminate those sorts of risks. And those sorts of risks are what stand out to farmers. Farmers are always trying to manage their risk. They want to mitigate problems. They want to manage the downside. They want to manage the potential to have to spend time unplugging their sprayer and missing the best time to apply the herbicide or fungicide or whatever it is. And so when you start to have a second tank, you start to decrease that negative perception in the farmer's mind, or at least you should start to decrease that perception. And so the multi-tank system is really notable, and it can also open up the door for variable rate applications of biostimulants, which has been something it's more difficult to do or operationalize at this time because nobody's really doing a specific pass over the field with biostimulants, though I'm sure in some instances you could argue that would be the case, but that has not been something that has driven farmers to take the sprayer across the field or pay a custom applicator to do so. So next, the other area that's interesting to look at is on the in-furrow side. And so liquid application capabilities at planting are increasingly being prioritized by farmers. There's been an increase anecdotally from my conversations in on-farm liquid fertilizer application assets. And there's a lot of innovation happening with planter boxes and in-furrow systems from companies like Meristem Crop Performance or BW Fusion or Indigo's Clips or even Pioneer's Next to Speedbox, which I believe is just an IP licensing from Meristem, but nonetheless, it is a major player with distribution that is using a unique system to deploy biologicals in the row or in the furrow. And so all of these systems make it easier to put a biostimulant in the right place at the right time without disrupting the operation. And on the seed side, integrating inputs onto and into the seed has been a long-standing priority for fungicides and insecticides. And it's continuing to be an opportunity for seed companies to derive better hybrid and varietal performance with biostimulants. And so I think once we see seed companies really gain confidence with specific products, this will grow in interest and we'll see them really double down on trying to get these types of molecules or products onto the seed. I think there's a limitation there, of course, because you have limited real estate that you can play with, but it's fundamentally an opportunity. And you start to look at how formulation technology can have increased concentration of active ingredient that can go on the seed. And so there's some interesting dynamics that could help further drive the demand for these biostimulant products in row crops moving forward. And so with that's kind of an overview of the global and the North American markets and some of the things driving the category. I think fundamentally we're going to see it grow. Is it going to be all roses? Probably not. I think there's still people that are skeptical. There's still a ton of challenges to get adoption where people want it to be or where it could be. But fundamentally, I think everything is moving in the right direction. But with that traction comes some other questions and some other challenges. And I think commoditization is one component that stood out in the report. And so if I had to pick one topic from the report to spend the most time on, it would be commoditization. That was something that I've been talking about it for a number of years within Upstream, and even before writing Upstream, it was something that was top of mind. And I think it's something that Dunham Trimmer talks about at length in the report and has talked about at length in other reports and other presentations and stuff as well. So we're very aligned in that. And I think it's really looked at as some of the defining challenges facing the biostimulant industry as we look forward. And you have a category that's growing well. You have rising interest from farmers. You have major incumbents pouring capital into the space through A and through internal R&D. You have new entrants from adjacent segments, crop protection companies, fertilizer manufacturers crossing that competitive field into biostimulants. And you have the existing biostimulant players expanding the reach and going after one another's customers more aggressively. So the level of competition has increased dramatically over a fairly short period of time, not to mention some of the VC dollars that have enabled startups. There's still this kind of low regulatory dynamic within biostimulants. So anybody can, low barriers to entry, you can essentially start up a company if you want and go start selling relatively quickly. And so I think I've heard people call them, bathtub brews and that sort of thing. So that's also contributed to the competitive dynamics. And I think when you start to go a step further, these products themselves are increasingly interchangeable, at least in the grower's eyes. And so IP protection in this category is weak and or not prioritized at all by companies. Many are just trade secret and mostly undifferentiated at the outcome level, meaning what the farmer experience in terms of product handleability or yield bump remains unchanged between various trade secrets of one company to another. And so the key active ingredients are often coming from the same suppliers, especially when you talk about hydrolysates imported from China, for example. Again, barriers to entry are low, and the go-to-market across most players looks very similar. And so you sell through ag retail, you do local trials, you have a salesperson tell a story, and you hope the product performs well enough that the farmer reorders next year. And so the result is predictably price-based competition. There's margin erosion and growing distributor leverage because you have scaled retailers that are increasingly demanding private label products, which further commoditizes the company supplying them if they don't have other branded products and strategy that's coherently aligned as well. And so the product performance itself, which is often variable from field to field and season to season, makes it hard for even genuinely superior products to consistently demonstrate an edge. And on top of that, when you start to look at the area I spend a lot of time in, which is North American row crops, biostimulants are still viewed by most farmers as non-essential. And so I've used this framework that's imperfect, but I call it the hierarchy of agronomic needs. And so I use it to describe what biostimulant companies really are experiencing. And if you imagine, and I'll have an image here as well, where if you imagine a pyramid of what a row crop farmer prioritizes, the foundational layer are the things that they will absolutely not skip. So you have seed, the core, you know, you need land, you need equipment. Obviously, those are the things you really fundamentally need to operate at scale. You don't necessarily need nitrogen. Of course, you're going to have a terrible yield if you don't have that, but you need to have some sort of nutrition source. But then you can get into herbicides, which again, you don't need, but if you don't have it, you're going to have some challenges unless you manage in other ways, meaning, intercropping, tillage, various other mechanisms. So once you get to the herbicide, then you can start to see where, okay, well, we get the fungicide, we get the seed treatment, we get the precision application capabilities. And once you get to the very top, meaning these are the last things that farmers are thinking about. And it's really based off of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the end of the day, you need your basic physiological things as a human. You need to be able to eat, you need to feel safe. And then as you go up, you get to this, basically like psychological position of where you feel great about yourself and all the emotional things, which again, not required to live day to day, but fundamentally help you live a better life. And I think this is where this comes into the applicability to farming, where you don't necessarily need biostimulants by any means, but if you're really trying to be a differentiated high-end farmer, these are the types of tools that you want to have to be able to manage your operation. And so but the reality is that that's not the view of most farmers today. And so biostimulants for most farmers sit in that upper portion, but they tend to not get applied unless prices look promising or when yield expectations are high or when the rest of the program is taken care of. So they're not the first thing a farmer thinks about when planning a season, whereas seed is. Biostimulant companies have been working hard to move their products down the hierarchy because in my mind, you can move products down that hierarchy. Specifically, if you're at the top, you can start to move those products down that hierarchy to have them viewed as more and more relevant to an annual decision or multiple times in season rather than I might cut it out this season. And so it just takes time through better education, better positioning, better support, better evidence-based ROI. But again, that just takes time to deliver. And so within this commoditization, though, Dunham Trimmer identified that the strategic responses companies are using to manage commoditization tend to cluster around several points of differentiation. They mentioned securing exclusive raw material supply chains through vertical integration, which is a play we've seen from a number of seaweed and humate companies. They mentioned acquiring local companies for distribution access and market knowledge, which is a play we've seen from the major incumbents as well. Even just as a base example, you can think of how Stoller for Corteva and their access into Brazil has been catalyzed because of that acquisition. Then they also talk about scaling manufacturing efficiency, which is more of a defensive move than any sort of differentiator. And then they mentioned increasing field presence, which Dunham Trimmer notes is consistently correlated with increased sales. Then they mentioned joint ventures and commercial agreements with distributors. And so all of these are reasonable strategies. None of them on their own are going to be sufficient. And it makes me think of a quote from strategist Roger Martin that I think about constantly when I look at this category. It's from a piece of his called Race to the Bottom. And it basically says the best way to spur a race to the bottom is for the competitors in an industry to drive down costs in the same way, and for each to focus on that as its hoped for way to win. And that is, they each incur the same set of costs in similar ways. That approach doesn't produce competitive advantage. That same thing can be said for differentiation. You need to actually do things uniquely. And so if every biostimulant company is pursuing the same set of differentiation strategies by acquiring distribution, by adding field reps, by securing raw material supply, by signing distributors and JVs, then none of them are actually differentiating that, call it intently or intentionally. They're all running the same sort of playbook, and the only thing that gets squeezed in those instances is margin. And so to genuinely outcompete in this category, a company has to do multiple things drastically different. Otherwise, they're in an expensive race to the bottom. And this is why, if you go back to even the very early days of Upstream, I talked a lot about horizontal companies in biologicals, meaning not companies that are identifying singular microbes or singular products, but talked a lot about these horizontal companies that are interesting because they're the companies that are providing picks and shovels, such as formulation capabilities or novel distribution advantages to every single player. And we've all seen the mixing bowls, really well done landscape of the biological segment. And there's just, I think there's 400 or 500 companies on that. And I think that, there's over 1,000 plus companies and around the globe. And so you start to look at just how difficult it is to stand out. But if you are an enabler of those companies, you have a bunch of different customers in a B2B fashion that you can go out and get your product onto those acres rather than having to go and do the full stack of getting onto the acre on your own. Again, one example maybe of that is Meristem Crop Performance. They stand out with their bio capsule IP, so they aggregate the right players to want to lean into their novel IP, not focus on deriving the best microorganism, for example. So I think when we think about this, what does differentiation look like? And so Dunham Trimmer points to an interesting concept that they call single biostimulant molecules. And I think this is an important idea from the report. And I just talked about how it can be challenging to find that one product, but if you are doing it right and designing it with a really methodical approach, I think it is pretty compelling. And so the thinking in the industry has been that, the biostimulant industry has historically been built on complex extracts and blends. So you have seaweed extracts that contain hundreds of compounds, and the active fraction varies from batch to batch depending on species and the harvest location, time of year, extraction process, all these different things. Even humic and fulvic acids are similarly complex. Protein hydrolysates depend heavily on the source material and the hydrolysis method. The result is a category where the products are genuinely difficult to standardize and where plant response is genuinely variable. And it reminds me a little bit of an area I spend a lot of time thinking about. I love bourbon and whiskey, and you have a lot of variance when you have different barrel structures where they sit in the rick house. And so it's the same sort of dynamic where when you're dealing with these natural sort of processes, you end up with a less consistent sort of product in many instances. Although I will say companies in seaweeds and other products have gotten better at this over time. But the alternative is really to identify, characterize, and scale specific molecules with defined modes of action on plant metabolism or rhizosphere pathways. And so it can be on these single molecules with known structures, known mechanisms, and predictable activity on the plants. And so if you think about crop protection R&D, you'll recognize this pattern as well, where crop protection discovery has moved heavily toward identifying specific molecular targets and designing precise compounds to act on them. And Bayer's CropKey platform is built on this logic. They map biological pathways, find novel target sites, and develop molecules to hit them. Evogene, AgPlenus subsidiary, does similar. And so this target and key framework has become the dominant sort of paradigm in next generation crop protection R&D. And Dunham Trimmer suggests, and I would tend to agree, that the same logic can be applied to biostimulants. Rather than working with complex extracts, the ability to try and differentiate through marketing narratives or constantly adding new molecules to a formulation in the hope that something hits, single molecule players are identifying specific compounds with defined mechanisms of action and building products around them. And so the logic is that if you move toward distinct molecules with known modes of action, you solve for some of that inconsistency problem. And more specificity means more consistent efficacy. More consistent efficacy means more replicable results. More replicable results means a defensible value proposition that doesn't collapse in price competition, at least not in the same way. And so it also means you can be much more precise in your messaging, which is something I'm passionate about in this segment. Just like a herbicide can target a specific weed in a specific crop at a specific timing, a single molecule biostimulant can target a specific physiological response in a specific crop under specific conditions. And I think of it as the funnel of specificity. And so you start with a specific problem in a crop at a specific growth stage under specific environmental conditions, and you work backwards to the product that addresses exactly that. And that kind of specificity is how you escape commoditization. And so that's really leads to another framework that I think applies here, which is working backwards, which is an approach from Amazon. And so there's a book by Colin Breyer and Bill Carr called Working Backwards that describes Amazon's innovation process, and or at least part of it. And so rather than starting with existing capabilities and looking for someone to sell them to, the Amazon team comes up with an idea and writes a mock press release announcing the finished product from the customer's perspective. So before they build anything, they do this to really understand what are they trying to do. And so if the press release doesn't make sense or doesn't articulate a clear customer benefit, the idea gets reworked or killed before resources are committed. And so I believe that same lens is useful for biostimulant innovation, starting with the specific outcome the farmer needs or the specific problem you're targeting or looking to solve based on plant physiology, and then work backwards to the molecule and mode of action from there. And so this segment and the single biostimulant molecules is still small as a share of total market value, but there are pure play single biostimulant molecule companies operating commercially today, and there are others in early stages of development. And so this sort of convergence of genomics and metabolomics has made it possible to actually understand how a biostimulant interacts with plant gene expression and metabolic pathways. And that's the foundation that makes this approach viable now in a way that it wasn't, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And I think there are still challenges within this segment too, with that single molecule, which is formulation, scalability, application rate compatibility in existing equipment and farming practices is another, and the regulatory uncertainty around how single biostimulant molecules will be classified is another commercialization risk. But if the parallels to crop protection's evolution hold, and I think they do, or I think they will, the long-term opportunity belongs to the companies that can engineer molecules for specific biological pathways and deliver specific agronomic outcomes. So stepping back from single molecules for a moment, I think the broader point about commoditization is that even simple IP or basic market access will only be so valuable to biostimulant companies going forward. You need it, of course, but what I think will actually differentiate the winners is the unique integration stack that a company can build. So the combination of raw material control, formulation compatibility, scientific understanding of mode of action, field level evidence, application technology and integration, distribution access, and farmer facing education all will combine together. And doing that in a really integrated way, I don't think any single one of them is enough. And doing those in the same combination as somebody else is another way to have commoditization. But companies that win will be the ones that combine several of these together in a way that their competitors cannot replicate. And so with that, I think I'll leave it there. There's a little bit more within the written report if you want to get into looking at some of the different future things that are going to drive biostimulant engagement, biostimulant use. I think if you start to look at some of the trends that are coming when it comes to, how soil sensing will help biologicals or biostimulants be or gain relevancy, or predictive technology can be supportive, implant sensing technology. There's a ton, or even just biostimulants and genetics and how this sort of thinking about varieties bred for altered root architecture and more efficient nutrient uptake and better foliar uptake capacity, or increased root exudates to help with the relationship between in-furrow applied products. So there's a ton of interesting things, I think, going on in this segment when you start to look at this sort of cross section of different things. And if you're interested in that, you can go check out the written article overall. But I think at the end of the day, there's a ton of interesting things going on in this segment. Maybe I'll leave you with a few things to think about with all of this. And so first, if you're operating in the biostimulant category, ask yourself whether your differentiation strategy is meaningfully different from your competitor's differentiation strategy. Actually, recently had a call with a biological company, and I might even have my notes sitting beside me. But essentially, uh, they said their goal was to be, I asked them, like, what do they think they look like in 2030? What differentiates them? What is going to enable them to win in the market with their portfolio, with their product strategy, with the technology they have? And they said something about being perceived as the market leader, which is an outcome of a bunch of actions, not the specific, hey, what do we want to be? What specifically do we want them to say about us? Because I think being the leader of an aggregate is, a pretty abstract and obscure and not specific enough to be relevant. But I think that's kind of the reality with a lot of these companies, is there's not a real strong point of view around what does the future look like for that business and how are you going to achieve it. And so I think when it comes down to it, really understanding what your differentiation strategy is, understanding what the goal is for the business to become. And I think if everyone's acquiring the same kinds of companies, hiring the same kinds of field reps, and signing the same kinds of distributors, then nobody's actually differentiating. It's just a really expensive race to the bottom. Another takeaway, I do think that the single biostimulant molecule conversation is really interesting. Whether or not your company chooses to play in that space, the trajectory that category is on looks a lot like the trajectory of crop protection products years ago. And I think what's also interesting that I didn't mention is you start to get some IP protection, which of course is very valuable for margins, for differentiation, for gaining traction, gaining trust with companies. And so I think the specificity, characterization, and known modes of action are going to matter a lot more in the future. And then third, I just recently touched on it, but the integration stack. And so really the companies that win in the next 5 years, 10 years are going to be the ones that combine several capabilities in ways their competitors can't replicate. And this is just strategy in general. I think when it comes to things like formulation and application technology and raw materials and distribution and education, how you think about those in interesting ways really goes a long way. And even just very specific positioning. I know I worked with a company a few years ago when I was doing some consulting, and they were a biostimulant company. And what we did for just one of their products, with they basically had everybody trying to apply it on every single thing, no matter what, because it helped with abiotic stress, I think was what they had at the time. And maybe it was, I believe it was heat stress or something. And it was like, well, let's tailor that to a specific crop that's high value in your specific region, that has a very specific stress response to heat and has a very specific application timing that's required to manage that, just like a fungicide, for example. And so we took that, and year over year, the success rate of that product and then the retention rate of that product were astronomical, because of being able to own a specific place in that customer's mind. And that was just with one positioning approach, not to mention some of the other segments that kind of conjoin with that, surrounding what they were starting to do and wanting to do with education, and how they were going to get or how they were going to change their approach to distribution. So I think there's some really interesting dynamics that can really play out if you do get really targeted with things in the segment. And so with that, I just want to give one more quick thank you to Dunham Trimmer for giving me access to the report and having the opportunity to share some of the insight from the report with you all. If you do want the report, head to the Dunham Trimmer website. And if you enjoyed this format, this is something new to me. I like to write because it's a good process to learn and tie things together. The audio and visual is still something I'm working on. So if you have feedback, I would love to hear it. All constructive feedback is valued and appreciated on my end, so it genuinely would help. And so with that, I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you asking questions. I appreciate you reaching out, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.